August 1944, Falaise, Normandy, France. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood in his command post on the morning of August 16th. His eyes moved across the large map spread out before him. The map showed something that made his jaw tight. Between the towns of Falaise and Argentan, barely 20 miles of open ground remained. Through that narrow gap, tens of thousands of German soldiers were trying to escape. Montgomery's fingers traced the thin corridor on the map. Smoke rose in the distance. He could hear the boom of big guns echoing across the Norman countryside. His staff officers stood nearby, watching him, waiting. Everyone knew what this moment meant. In 48 hours, Canadian troops would accomplish something that would pull rare words of praise from Montgomery's lips. Words he seldom spoke about anyone. They've bloody well done it. But right now, on this hot August morning, no one knew if it could be done. The war had been raging for 2 months since D-Day. American, British, and Canadian soldiers had stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6th. They thought they would break out fast. They were wrong. For weeks, soldiers fought and died in the hedgerows. Field after field became a battlefield. Farms were bought with blood. The Germans fought hard. They made the Allies pay for every mile. In late July, the stalemate broke. The Americans punched through in the south. The Canadians pushed forward in the north. The German army tried to fight back. They launched a big attack at a place called Mortain. Hitler himself ordered it. He wanted to cut the Allied armies in half. The attack failed. Now the Germans were trapped. Army Group B, with more than 100,000 German soldiers, sat in a huge pocket. Think of it like a bag with one opening. American forces blocked the south. British, Canadian, and Polish forces blocked the north and west. Only one way out remained open, that gap near Falaise, just 20 miles wide. If the Allies could close it, they would destroy Germany's entire Western army. The war might end months sooner. Thousands of lives might be saved. But there was a big problem. Falaise sat on top of a hill. From there, German soldiers could see everything. German forces dug deep defensive positions with big guns and tanks protecting every approach. Worst of all, SS troops held the town. The SS were Hitler's most loyal soldiers. They would fight to the death. They knew if they lost here, the war was over. General George Patton's American army had pushed north. They reached Argentan. Then they stopped. Patton wanted to keep going, but the orders said no. The plan said the Canadians would come down from the north. They would meet the Americans. Together, they would slam the door shut. Now everything depended on the Canadians. Montgomery looked at his watch. With each passing hour, more Germans escaped. Under cover of darkness, German trucks and tanks rolled east through the gap. They left behind the slow ones, the wounded, the unlucky. But thousands were getting away. Those soldiers who escaped would fight again. Those tanks would kill Allied soldiers somewhere else. The field marshal's face showed no emotion, but inside he felt the pressure. General Eisenhower, the supreme commander, was watching. American generals had their doubts. They wondered if the British and Canadians could move fast enough. They wondered if Montgomery's careful planning would let the Germans slip away. Some whispered that Patton should have been allowed to close the gap himself. Montgomery knew the Canadian First Army had a tough job. They had to attack across open ground. The summer wheat fields offered no cover. German soldiers would see them coming from miles away. The Canadians would have to charge into machine gun fire. They would face German tanks. They would fight house to house through villages turned into fortresses. The August heat would beat down on them. Dust would choke them, and they had to do it fast. General Harry Crerar commanded the Canadian First Army. Under him, Lieutenant General Guy Simonds led the 2nd Canadian Corps. Symonds was young for his rank. He was smart. He tried new ideas. His soldiers had already fought through some of the worst battles in Normandy. They had taken the city of Caen. They had faced the Hitler Youth SS division and beaten them. But this would be different. This was a race against time. The Canadians had started their attack 2 days ago. They were making progress, but it was slow. Too slow. The Germans fought for every inch. Villages that looked tiny on the map took hours to capture. Fields that seemed empty hid deadly weapons. Canadian soldiers were dying. Tanks were burning. And Falaise still stood on its hill, 12 miles away. Montgomery straightened up from the map. He looked out the window toward the battlefield. Somewhere out there, Canadian boys from farms and cities were fighting. Some were veterans. Others had never seen combat before. They were cold at night and hot during the day. They were scared and brave at the same time. They missed home. But they kept going forward because someone had to close that gap. Every hour of delay meant thousands of German soldiers slipping through like sand through fingers. The field marshal needed that pocket closed. He needed it now. The whole war might turn on what happened in the next 2 days. What he didn't expect was how the Canadians would do it. He didn't know about the night attacks that were coming. He didn't know about the courage and sacrifice that would be needed. He didn't know that in just 48 hours he would look at his staff officers and say something he rarely said about anyone. But first, the Canadians had to take Falaise. And as the sun climbed higher on August 16th, that seemed like the hardest thing in the world. The story of Falaise really started 2 months earlier on June 6, 1944. That morning, thousands of ships crossed the English Channel. Soldiers from America, Britain, and Canada landed on 5 beaches in Normandy. They called it D-Day. Everyone thought the hard part would be getting ashore. They were wrong. The hard part came after. For weeks, the Allied armies barely moved. The Norman countryside looked peaceful with its green fields and stone farmhouses. But those fields hid death. The French farmers had planted hedgerows everywhere. These were thick walls of dirt and bushes that divided every field. The Germans turned each one into a fortress. Allied soldiers would take one field, and 10 more waited beyond it. Men died for a few hundred yards. Tanks got stuck. Progress was measured in feet, not miles. By late July, the Allied commanders knew they had to try something different. The Americans launched Operation Cobra. Their planes dropped thousands of bombs. Their tanks punched through. General Patton's Third Army broke into open country and started racing south and east. At the same time, the Canadians tried their own breakthrough toward Falaise. They called it Operation Totalize. It worked at first, then the Germans stopped them cold. Hitler made a terrible mistake. Instead of pulling back, he ordered his armies to attack. On August 7th, German tanks rolled west toward a town called Mortagne. Hitler wanted to cut the American breakout in half and reach the sea. If it worked, thousands of American soldiers would be trapped. But it didn't work. American forces held. German tanks burned on the roads. Now the Germans were stuck. They had pushed forward into a trap of their own making. Allied commanders saw their chance. The German Army Group B sat in a bulging pocket. American forces blocked them from the south. British and Canadian forces pressed from the north. If the Allies could close the gap near Falaise, they would capture or kill every German soldier inside. It would be one of the biggest victories of the war. The job of closing the gap fell to the Canadian First Army. This was a big moment for Canada. For the first time, Canadian forces operated as a complete army under their own commander. General Harry Crerar led them. He had waited his whole career for this. Under him was Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, who commanded the 2nd Canadian Corps. Simons was only 41 years old, but already had a reputation. He thought like a teacher, always looking for better ways to fight. He tried new tactics that other generals thought were too risky. The Canadian Army included several divisions. The 4th Canadian Armored Division had tanks and moved fast. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and 2nd Canadian Infantry Division were foot soldiers who fought the close-up battles. The Polish 1st Armored Division also fought under Canadian command. These Polish soldiers had special reasons to fight. The Germans had taken their homeland. They could never go home while the Nazis ruled Poland. They fought with a fierce anger born of loss. Many Canadian soldiers were veterans who fought in Sicily and Italy, pushing north through mountains and mud. These men knew combat, but others were brand new. Farm boys from Saskatchewan had never heard a gun fired in anger. Factory workers from Ontario had never seen a dead man. Now they were all together, heading toward Falaise. The town of Falaise sat on high ground about 12 miles north of where the pocket closed. From Falaise, you could see for miles across the flat Norman countryside. The Germans knew this. They put their best troops there. The 12th SS Panzer Division held the town. People called them the Hitler Youth because they were so young and so devoted to Nazi ideas. They would never surrender. Around them were parts of 5 other German divisions with tanks, big guns, and plenty of ammunition. Between the Canadians and Falaise lay open wheat fields. The summer wheat had grown tall and golden, but it offered no protection from bullets. Any soldier crossing those fields would be seen. German gunners on the heights would cut them down. Small villages dotted the landscape. Each one had been turned into a fortress. Stone houses became bunkers. Church towers became watchtowers. Every barn hid a gun. The August heat made everything harder. During the day, the sun beat down without mercy. Soldiers sweated through their uniforms. The dry ground created dust clouds whenever trucks or tanks moved. That dust hung in the air and told the Germans exactly where the Canadians were coming from. At night, it got cold. Soldiers shivered in their foxholes and wished for morning, even though morning brought more fighting. Montgomery felt the pressure every day. General Eisenhower sent messages asking about progress. American commanders whispered that the British and Canadians moved too slowly. Some said Patton should have been allowed to close the gap from the south. Every criticism stung. Montgomery needed results. He needed the Canadians to prove they could fight as hard and fast as anyone. His reputation depended on it. More importantly, thousands of lives depended on it. Intelligence officers reported that German convoys moved through the gap every night. Under cover of darkness, trucks and half-tracks carried soldiers east to safety. Tanks followed. Every German who escaped would fight another day. Every weapon that got through would kill Allied soldiers later. The clock was ticking. The Canadians had already started their attack, but Falaise seemed as far away as the moon. The Germans fought like cornered wolves. And everyone wondered if the Canadians could break through before it was too late. On August 14th, General Simons launched Operation Tractable. This was the big push. The Canadians had to cover the last 12 miles to Falaise. They had to do it fast. Simons made a bold choice. Unlike most attacks, this one would start in daylight. He wanted to surprise the Germans. He thought they would expect another night attack. He was gambling with the lives of his men. Early that morning, the sky filled with planes. 720 heavy bombers flew over the battlefield. Their job was to blast the German defenses and make a path for the Canadian soldiers. Artillery guns opened up too. Hundreds of cannons roared. The ground shook. Smoke and dust rose into the sky. From a distance, it looked like the whole world was exploding. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and the 4th Canadian Armored Division moved forward. They had special armor to help them, flail tanks with chains that beat the ground to explode mines, tanks that carried bridges, tanks that threw flames. These machines looked strange, but they saved lives. Behind them came thousands of soldiers on foot and in trucks. Everyone thought this would be the breakthrough they needed. Then something went wrong. Some of the bombers dropped their loads too soon. Instead of hitting Germans, the bombs fell on Canadian and Polish troops. Explosions ripped through friendly lines. Men died before they even saw the enemy. Others lay wounded, screaming for medics. The soldiers who survived were shaken. They had to keep moving forward, but now they were scared of their own planes as much as the Germans. The bombardment created another problem. All those explosions stirred up massive clouds of dust. The dry August ground turned to powder. Soon no one could see anything. Tank commanders couldn't find their way. Infantry units got separated from each other. The careful plans fell apart. Canadian soldiers wandered through the dust, trying to find their positions. German gunners just waited for the dust to clear, then started shooting at anything that moved. When the Canadians finally crossed into the open wheat fields, the Germans were ready. Big 88mm guns fired from the high ground. These guns could punch through tank armor like paper. Canadian Sherman tanks exploded one after another. Flames shot up. Black smoke poured out. Crews tried to escape, but many didn't make it. The wheat fields became graveyards for burning metal. German soldiers of the 12th SS fought like demons. They were young, barely older than teenagers, but trained to never give up. They fired their machine guns until the barrels glowed red. When Canadian soldiers got close, the Germans fought with grenades and rifles and even knives. Trapped with no escape if Falaise fell, they fought with the strength of desperate men. The village of Sassy became a nightmare. Canadian tanks rolled in and hit mines. The explosions flipped 30-ton machines like toys. Infantry tried to clear the houses, but Germans hid in every room. Snipers in the church tower picked off officers. The Canadians had to fight building by building, room by room. Bodies lay in the streets. The wounded cried out. The smell of smoke and death filled the air. After 12 hours of fighting, the Canadians had only moved 4 miles. They needed to move 8. August 15th brought more grinding combat. Villages with names like Soulangy and Perrières had to be taken. The Germans turned every stone house into a bunker. Canadian infantry crawled through ditches to get close. They threw grenades through windows. They kicked down doors. Sometimes they found Germans waiting. Sometimes they found empty rooms. Either way, it took hours to clear each village. The Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada attacked one small village. It didn't even show up big on the map. But the Germans had machine guns covering every approach. The Highlanders charged anyway. They lost 125 men, taking that one village. Fathers and sons and brothers fell in the same fields. The survivors kept going because there was nothing else to do. Canadian tank crews faced German Tigers and Panthers up close. The German tanks were bigger with superior guns. Tigers could kill Shermans from a mile away, while the smaller Canadian tanks needed to close within 300 yards for an effective shot. Canadian tankers showed incredible courage, using speed and numbers to overwhelm their opponents. 5 Shermans against each Tiger. Some would burn, but one might get close enough for the killing shot. The battlefield looked like the end of the world. Dead bodies lay in the wheat fields, turning black under the August sun. Burned-out tanks smoked. Broken equipment littered the roads. The smell was terrible. Soldiers wrapped scarves around their faces, but it didn't help. The smell of death got into everything. It stuck to uniforms and hair and skin. By evening on August 15th, Canadian casualties mounted steadily. Hundreds of men were dead or wounded. The aid stations overflowed. Medics worked without rest, trying to save lives. But still, Falaise sat on its hill. The Germans still held it. The gap still remained open. Intelligence officers brought bad news. German convoys were escaping through the gap every night. Time was running out. General Simons faced a hard choice. He could keep attacking the same way and hope to break through, or he could try something different. His soldiers were exhausted. Ammunition was running low. Morale was being tested. But the mission hadn't changed. Close the gap, stop the Germans, win the war. That night, as soldiers tried to rest in their foxholes, Simons made his decision. He would try something rarely done in 1944. He would attack at night. It was risky. It could end in disaster. But doing the same thing over and over wasn't working. The Canadians had one more push left in them, one more chance to do the impossible. Everything hung in the balance. General Simons gave his orders as darkness fell on August 15th. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division would attack at night. They would slip through the German lines like ghosts. While they moved in darkness, the 4th Armored Division would attack in a different spot to draw German attention. It was a gamble. Night attacks were rare in 1944. Soldiers could get lost. They could shoot their own men by mistake. But Simons believed it was the only way. The Fusiliers Mont-Royal and the South Saskatchewan Regiment led the way. These were tough soldiers. Many spoke French. They had grown up in small towns and farms across Canada. Now they crept through the Norman night, carrying rifles and grenades, their hearts pounding in their chests. They moved slowly and carefully. Every sound seemed loud, the crack of a twig, the clink of metal on metal, the whisper of voices giving orders. Scouts went first. These brave men crawled ahead in the darkness. They cut through barbed wire with special tools that made almost no sound. When they found German sentries, they had to silence them quickly and quietly. It was ugly work. It was necessary work. They marked safe paths for the men behind them. White tape tied to stakes. Small lights that only showed from one direction. Follow these markers or die. Simons had another trick. He ordered searchlights set up behind the Canadian lines. These powerful lights pointed straight up at the clouds. The light bounced off the clouds and came back down, creating a strange artificial moonlight. The Canadians called it artificial moonlight. It gave just enough light to see shapes and move forward, but not enough for German gunners to aim well. It was an eerie sight. The whole battlefield glowed with ghostly pale light. The Canadian infantry moved through the darkness like shadows. They bypassed German strongpoints instead of attacking them. When they found a village full of Germans, they went around it. Speed mattered more than clearing every position. The Germans heard movement in the night. They fired their guns into the darkness. Bullets zipped through the air, but they couldn't see what they were shooting at. The Canadians kept moving. As dawn broke on August 16th, Canadian soldiers were behind German lines. The Germans woke up to find enemy forces in places they shouldn't be. Confusion spread. German commanders couldn't figure out where the Canadians were or how many. Radio messages flew back and forth. Contradictory orders came down. Some German units tried to fall back. Others stayed to fight. The careful German defense began to crack. At first light, the Canadian armored units exploded forward. They drove through gaps the infantry had found. German soldiers saw tanks coming from directions they thought were safe. Panic set in. The careful German defense crumbled as the breakthrough gained momentum. The Lincoln and Welland Regiment reached the southern edge of Falaise as the sun came up. They could see the medieval town on its hill. Church spires rose above stone buildings. Some houses were already burning from artillery fire. The town that had seemed so far away for so long was finally within reach, but the hardest fighting still lay ahead. By mid-morning, 3 Canadian groups were pushing into Falaise from different directions. The Germans inside the town fought back with everything they had. Machine guns fired from windows, snipers hid in attics. Every street became a battle. Every house had to be cleared. The Canadians used grenades and rifles. They fired through doors and climbed through holes in walls. It was slow, brutal work. The Fusiliers Mont-Royal moved through the narrow medieval streets. These French-Canadian soldiers felt a special connection to this French town. They called out to civilians in French, telling them to stay inside, stay safe. They methodically cleared each building. Kick in the door, throw a grenade, rush in with rifles ready. Sometimes they found Germans, sometimes they found terrified French families hiding in cellars. The Fusiliers helped civilians when they could, then moved to the next building. German defenders used the ancient castle ruins in the town center as a fortress. The stone walls were thick. Modern weapons barely dented them. Canadian soldiers had to fight their way up narrow staircases. They threw grenades around corners. They traded shots at close range in dark hallways. Men died in rooms built 600 years ago by French nobles who never imagined such horror. Throughout the day, individual Canadian soldiers showed amazing courage. Major David Curry led his tank squadron straight through a German ambush. His tanks fired in all directions. He stood in his turret, directing the battle even as bullets pinged off the metal around him. Private J.A. Curry, no relation to the major, charged a German position by himself when his squad was pinned down. He killed or captured 12 Germans and cleared the way forward. Canadian medics worked without rest. They treated wounded Canadians and wounded Germans side by side in a destroyed church. The medics didn't care which uniform a man wore. They just tried to stop the bleeding and ease the pain. One medic said later that in the church, with the roof blown off and everyone bleeding, the war stripped away everything except their shared humanity. French civilians emerged from cellars and basements as the fighting moved past. They had been trapped in the battle for days. Some had lost their homes. Many had lost loved ones. But they were alive. Canadian soldiers shared their food and water with the civilians. They helped dig out survivors trapped under collapsed buildings. Even in the middle of war, humanity survived. Early that afternoon, the fighting in Falaise began to wind down. German resistance weakened. More Germans surrendered. Canadian engineers were already pushing south toward the town of Troun. Their job was to completely seal the pocket. The race wasn't over yet, but Falaise, the key to closing the gap, was falling. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Canadian soldiers raised the Union Jack over Falaise's town center. The flag snapped in the breeze above the battered town. Men who had fought for 2 days without sleep stood and watched. Emotions overwhelmed them. Exhausted soldiers sat down, too tired to process what they had accomplished. They had done it. Falaise was theirs. Word reached Montgomery's headquarters later that evening. Staff officers brought him the message. Montgomery studied his map in silence. His finger traced the line from the Canadian start positions to Falaise. 48 hours. 12 miles through determined German resistance. His staff officers watched him, waiting to see how he would react. Finally, Montgomery looked up. According to the officers who were there, he said something he rarely said about anyone. "The Canadians have done it," he said quietly. Then louder, with feeling, "They've bloody well done it." For Montgomery, a man who rarely praised anyone, these words meant everything. The Canadians had not just won a battle, they had proven themselves. They had shown they could move fast, fight hard, and win against the best the Germans had. The road to victory was now open, and the Canadians had opened it. The fall of Falaise on August 16th was just the beginning. The Canadian and Polish forces still had to completely seal the pocket. Every hour counted. German soldiers were trying desperately to escape through the narrowing gap. Some would make it, most would not. 3 days after Falaise fell, on August 19th, Polish soldiers reached the small town of Chambois. The Polish 1st Armored Division had fought their way south while Canadians pushed from the west. When they met American forces coming from the south, the trap slammed shut. The Falaise-Chambois gap was finally closed. Approximately 100,000 German soldiers were caught inside with no way out. What happened next was terrible beyond description. German units tried to break through the Allied lines. They attacked again and again, trying to punch a hole to escape. Canadian and Polish soldiers held firm. Artillery rained down on the packed German formations. Fighter planes swooped low, firing rockets and machine guns. The killing went on for days. About 50,000 Germans had escaped in the early days before the pocket closed completely. They got through the gap when it was still wide, but they left behind all their heavy equipment. Tanks, trucks, and guns were abandoned on the roads. These soldiers made it out alive, but they would never fight as an organized army again. Another 10,000 Germans died trying to break through after the pocket sealed. They charged Allied positions, knowing they would probably die. Some fought because they were brave. Others fought because they were more afraid of their own officers than of Allied bullets. Inside the pocket, 50,000 more Germans were trapped. Most surrendered within days. They were hungry, tired, and out of ammunition. They had fought hard, but now it was over. They laid down their weapons and put their hands up. Long columns of prisoners marched toward Allied prison camps. Many looked relieved that their war was finally finished. General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, visited the battlefield a few days later. He wanted to see the results with his own eyes. What he saw shocked him. For miles, the roads were choked with destroyed vehicles and dead horses. The Germans had used thousands of horses to pull their wagons and guns. Now, those horses lay dead in piles. Hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles sat burned and twisted. The smell was unbearable. Bodies lay everywhere, swelling in the August heat. Eisenhower later said it was one of the greatest killing fields of the war. He had seen many battlefields, but nothing like this. Canadian soldiers were given the grim job of burying the dead. They worked in teams, wearing masks over their faces, but the smell got through anyway. They dug mass graves and moved bodies for days. No one talked much during this work. What was there to say? They counted as they went. 344 German tanks and assault guns destroyed. 2,447 vehicles. 252 artillery pieces. The numbers told the story of a German army that no longer existed. Montgomery sent official messages praising the Canadian First Army. He noted their speed and determination. Years later, he wrote in his memoirs that the Canadian Army had come of age in Normandy. For Montgomery, who rarely praised anyone, these words carried weight. The Canadians had proven themselves among the best fighting forces in the world. The Germans, who survived, saw things differently. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge had commanded German forces in France. After Falaise, he wrote a final message to Hitler. The enemy's superiority is overwhelming. Then he killed himself. He knew what failure meant in Hitler's Germany. SS General Kurt Meyer was captured by Canadian forces. Later, he described the Canadian night attack as impossible to defend against. Even in defeat, German officers recognized what the Canadians had accomplished. General Simons credited his soldiers for the victory. He praised their innovative tactics and determination. General Crerar felt vindicated. His army had delivered when it mattered most. Unit commanders felt pride mixed with sadness. They had won, but at a terrible cost. Other Allied leaders had different reactions. Eisenhower was finally convinced of Canadian effectiveness. Some British generals expressed surprise at how fast the breakthrough happened. American commanders, some who had doubted, now acknowledged what the Canadians achieved. A few did so grudgingly. Old rivalries don't disappear overnight. But the facts spoke for themselves. The human cost was staggering. During Operation Tractable, 1,470 Canadian soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing. Some units lost half their men. The Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders lost 50% of their fighting strength. Young men who had been laughing and joking just days before were now gone. The Polish forces lost 1,441 soldiers, including the beloved Chief of Staff to General Maxek. Every Polish soldier knew they were fighting for a homeland they might never see again. That made each loss even more painful. German losses were much worse. 10,000 died in the pocket. 50,000 were captured. Many more were wounded. These numbers represented destroyed families back in Germany. Mothers who would never see their sons again. Wives who would become widows. Children who would grow up without fathers. But even in this place of death and destruction, humanity survived. Canadian soldiers shared their canteens with thirsty German prisoners. German medics were allowed to treat their own wounded under Canadian Guard. One Canadian officer watched this and said, "They fought us to the death, then surrendered with dignity. War is strange that way." French civilians emerged from their hiding places. They had spent days in cellars while the battle raged above. Now they came out blinking in the sunlight, hardly believing they were alive. They embraced their Canadian liberators. Old women kissed soldiers on both cheeks. Children stared wide-eyed at the foreign soldiers who spoke a different language but smiled kindly. French farmers shared what little food they had saved. Canadian soldiers shared their rations with hungry civilians. In one destroyed church, a Canadian medic bandaged a German soldier's wounds. The German was young, maybe 18. He cried as the medic worked, not from pain, but from relief. He had thought he would die in that field. Now a man whose uniform he had been trying to kill was saving his life. The medic patted his shoulder. "You're going to be okay, son," he said, even though the German probably didn't understand English. Some things don't need translation. The victory at Falaise came at a price measured in blood and tears, but it was a necessary price. The German army in France was broken. The road to Paris lay open. The war would end sooner because of what happened in those Norman fields. And in the years to come, the soldiers who survived would remember not just the fighting, but also the small moments of mercy and kindness that proved they were still human beings, even in the middle of hell. The closing of the Falaise pocket changed everything. The German Army Group B was destroyed. These weren't just soldiers who lost a battle. This was an entire army that ceased to exist as a fighting force. Elite divisions that had names like the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr were reduced to small groups of survivors without tanks or guns. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had terrorized Allied forces for months, was gone. Germany lost more men at Falaise in 2 weeks than they lost at Stalingrad over 6 months. That was how complete the destruction was. With no German army left to defend France, the Allied advance became a race. Paris was liberated on August 25th, just 9 days after Falaise fell. French resistance fighters rose up inside the city. Free French forces under General Leclerc entered first, followed by American troops. General de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées to wild cheering. The city Hitler had wanted to destroy was free. Without Falaise, this couldn't have happened so fast. The Allied armies didn't stop in Paris. They kept rolling east. British and Canadian forces liberated Brussels on September 3rd. American armies reached the German border. In just weeks, the Allies covered ground that should have taken months. They moved so fast that supply lines couldn't keep up. Trucks ran out of gas. Soldiers marched on empty stomachs. But they kept going because no German army stood in their way. Historians later calculated that closing the Falaise pocket shortened the war in Western Europe by 4 to 6 months. That meant tens of thousands of lives saved, families reunited sooner, cities spared from bombing. The impact on Germany's ability to fight was crushing. Before Falaise, Germany had 850,000 soldiers in France. They had 1,500 tanks. After Falaise, only 120,000 effective fighting men remained. They had 200 tanks. 25 German divisions needed to be completely rebuilt from scratch. But Germany didn't have the men or equipment to rebuild them. The Eastern Front was consuming everything. Hitler had to strip troops from the fight against Russia just to create some defense in the West. This weakened Germany everywhere. The disaster also forced Germany to change how it fought. Hitler stopped trusting his generals in France. Field Marshal von Kluge was dead by his own hand. Field Marshal Model replaced him, but even Model couldn't fix what was broken. The German High Command realized they couldn't win defensive battles in the West anymore. They didn't have enough troops or tanks. Instead, they focused on delaying tactics. Hold a city for a week, then retreat, blow up bridges, make the Allies fight for every mile. It was the strategy of a losing side. Falaise completely changed how the world saw the Canadian military. Before Normandy, many people thought of Canadians as junior partners to the British. Brave, certainly, but not in the same league as elite forces. After Falaise, no one thought that way anymore. Montgomery, who was famously hard to impress, started requesting Canadian units for the toughest assignments. When he needed a breakthrough, he called on the Canadians. They had proven they could move fast and hit hard. The Canadian soldiers themselves felt the change. They walked taller, their confidence transformed by what they had achieved. The tactical innovations that Simonds used at Falaise became studied at military schools around the world. His 9-attack method was copied by other armies. The way he combined different types of forces, infantry, tanks, artillery, and air support, all working together, became the model for modern warfare. The artificial moonlight technique using searchlights bounced off clouds was adopted as standard practice. Military historians still study Falaise as an example of how to break through a strong defense with speed and surprise. Even the Germans learned from Falaise, though the lessons were bitter. German officers who survived wrote reports about what went wrong. They noted the Canadian breakthrough speed as unprecedented. They said the determination they faced was impossible to stop. German training manuals were updated. Future defensive plans tried to account for the kind of rapid night infiltration that Simonds had used. Of course, by then it was too late. Germany was losing on all fronts. The impact on morale was enormous on both sides. For the Allies, Falaise proved the war could be won. After months of slow progress and heavy casualties, they had struck a blow that hurt Germany badly. Soldiers who had been discouraged felt hope again. Letters home became more optimistic. Maybe they would see their families before Christmas after all. For the Germans, Falaise was crushing. Soldiers who survived told stories of the horror. word spread that the German army in France was finished. Some German units started surrendering more easily. Others fought even harder, knowing their backs were to the wall. General Hans Eberbach commanded German forces during the battle. He was captured afterward. Allied interrogators asked him about Falaise. Eberbach was quiet for a moment, then said, "Falaise was the death of the German army in France." He wasn't exaggerating. German officers after the war consistently identified Falaise as the moment they knew the Western Front was lost. They had hoped to hold the Allies in France through the winter. Falaise destroyed that hope. The numbers tell a stark story. Before Falaise, Allied planners estimated it would take 6 months to fight from Normandy to the German border. They expected fierce resistance every mile, heavy casualties, slow progress. Instead, most of France was liberated in 3 weeks. The difference was the destruction of Army Group B at Falaise. Without that German army blocking the way, the Allies could advance at speeds no one thought possible. Hitler's last desperate gamble in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes, happened because of Falaise. Germany had to scrape together every available tank and soldier for that offensive. They stripped other fronts bare. They used up their last fuel reserves. It was a roll of the dice because Germany had no strategic reserve left. Falaise had destroyed that reserve. When the Bulge offensive failed, Germany had nothing left. The war would drag on for a few more bloody months, but the outcome was decided. The wider world watched and learned. The Soviet Union saw that Western allies could conduct large-scale, offensive operations successfully. This affected post-war calculations about power and influence. Smaller nations saw that a country like Canada, not one of the traditional great powers, could field a world-class army. This changed how nations thought about their own defense and alliances. In the grand sweep of World War II, many battles were larger than Falaise. Stalingrad, Kursk, and the Battle of Berlin involved more soldiers and lasted longer. But few battles had such immediate and dramatic impact. Falaise broke the German army in France. It opened the door to Paris and beyond. It shortened the war and saved countless lives. And it proved that the Canadian army, fighting under its own flag and its own commanders, belonged among the very best fighting forces in the world. That changed everything. Behind every battle are the stories of real people. Falaise was no different. Some became heroes. Some died trying. Some were just ordinary men caught up in extraordinary events. Their stories deserve to be remembered. Major David Curry commanded C Squadron of the South Alberta Regiment. On August 18th, his squadron of 175 men reached the village of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive. This village sat right in the path of Germans trying to escape the pocket. Curry knew that if he held this spot, he could trap thousands of German soldiers. So he dug in and prepared to fight. For 36 hours, Curry and his men fought off desperate German attacks. Thousands of Germans tried to break through. Tiger tanks fired at Curry's positions. Infantry charged again and again. Curry was everywhere at once. He personally knocked out several German tanks. He called in artillery strikes. When he was wounded, he refused to leave. His men watched him and found their own courage. When it was over, Curry's small force had captured 2,100 German soldiers. They had destroyed 7 tanks, 12 guns, and 40 vehicles. For this, Curry received the Victoria Cross, Canada's highest honor for bravery. After the war, he returned to Ontario and lived a quiet life. He rarely talked about what he did. When asked, he would just say, "I did what needed doing. Any of my men would have done the same." Private Jacques Dextraz was 22 years old when he fought through the streets of Falaise. He was part of the Fusiliers Mont-Royal, a French-Canadian unit. Dextres later described the battle as like fighting through history itself. The medieval stone buildings, the narrow ancient streets, the castle ruins where Germans made their last stand. During the final assault, Dextres found 3 French children hiding in a cellar. The building above them was burning. He carried them out one by one under fire. After the war, Dextres stayed in the army. He rose through the ranks and eventually became Chief of Defense Staff, the highest military position in Canada. But he always said his men made him look good. They did the impossible, he would say. I just had the honor of leading them. Not all stories have happy endings. Many Canadian soldiers never came home from Falaise. Young men like Private Harold Smith of the Regina Rifles died in the wheat fields outside Falaise. He was just 20 years old. His best friend from basic training, Private Robert Chen, died beside him. They had promised their families they would look after each other. They kept that promise until the end. The Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders lost 125 men, taking a single village. Each name represented a family back home who would receive a telegram they dreaded. Each loss was a future stolen, a life unlived. The Germans had their own stories. Lieutenant Ernst Barkmann commanded a Panther tank in the 2nd SS Panzer Division. He was a skilled tank commander who had survived many battles. At Falaise, he fought until his tank ran out of ammunition. Then he fought on foot until he was captured near Troon. Years after the war, Barkmann gave interviews about his experience. The Canadians gave no quarter in the attack, he said, but they treated us fairly after we surrendered. He described the Canadian night attacks as terrifying. They came from everywhere, like ghosts, he remembered. We couldn't see them. We couldn't stop them. Barkmann lived until 2009. In his old age, he attended German-Canadian friendship events. Former enemies shook hands as old men and remembered they had all once been young and scared. Civilians suffered too. Marie Dubois was 16 years old and lived in Falaise with her family. When the battle started, her family hid in their cellar. For 6 days they stayed underground while the fighting raged above. They heard explosions. They heard gunfire. They heard men screaming. Sometimes the house shook so hard they thought it would collapse on them. When they finally emerged, their town was in ruins, but they were alive. A soldier from the Fusilier Mont-Royal found them. He was French-Canadian and spoke French like them. He gave Marie's family his own food rations. Marie remembered that he cried when he saw what the war had done to their beautiful town. I expected soldiers, she said years later, but I found angels in khaki. Major General Stanisław Maciek commanded the Polish 1st Armored Division. His division closed the pocket at Chambois, a feat the Allies called the Mace after his name. But every Polish soldier knew a bitter truth. They were fighting to free Europe, but their own country, Poland, was occupied by the Soviet Union. They could never go home. They fought anyway because someone had to stand against evil. The division lost 1,441 men, closing the gap. After the battle, Maciek spoke to his surviving soldiers. "We fight not for glory," he said, "but for the world to remember Poland exists." Maciek lived until 1994 in Scotland. Both Canadians and Poles honored him as a hero. Private William Baker was 19 years old, a farm boy from Saskatchewan serving with the Regina Rifles. This was his first battle. Letters home to his family described his fear and exhaustion. But he also wrote about pride in what his unit accomplished. He was wounded on August 16th, taking Falaise. Shrapnel hit his shoulder. He recovered and fought all the way to Germany. He survived the war and returned to his farm. He lived to be 89 years old. Every year he attended Falaise ceremonies with other veterans. Near the end of his life, he told his grandson, "We didn't think of ourselves as heroes. We were just Canadians doing a job. That simple statement captured something important. These were ordinary men who did extraordinary things because their country and their buddies needed them to. In Canada today, every schoolchild learns about Falaise. It sits alongside Vimy Ridge as one of the defining moments when Canada proved itself as a nation. Teachers tell the story of how Canadian soldiers closed the gap in 48 hours. They explain how this shortened the war and saved lives. On Remembrance Day, every November 11th, when Canadians wear red poppies and stand in silence, many think of those Norman fields where their grandfathers and great-grandfathers fought. The town of Falaise rebuilt after the war. Today, it's a peaceful place with shops and cafes. But the people there never forgot who liberated them. In the center of town sits a park dedicated to Canadian soldiers. Stone monuments bear the names of units that fought there. Fresh flowers appear at the base of these monuments every week, placed by French citizens who remember. One street is named Rue des Canadiens, the Street of the Canadians. Children walk to school along that street every day, passing beneath the sign that honors soldiers from across the ocean who died to free their town. Near the village of Chambois, where Polish and Canadian forces met to seal the pocket, stands a special memorial. Local people call it the Mace, in honor of General Maxek. The monument shows a Polish and Canadian soldier standing together. Every August, people gather there for ceremonies. For many years, old veterans made the journey back. They wore their medals and stood with tears running down their faces. They saluted fallen friends. As the years passed, fewer veterans could make the trip. Now the last of them are gone. But their children and grandchildren come instead, carrying on the tradition. The Canadian War Cemetery at Bretteville-sur-Laize holds 2,958 graves. White headstones stand in perfect rows. Each one bears a maple leaf carved in stone. The grass is always perfectly cut. Flowers bloom in the spring. It's a beautiful, peaceful place. But it reminds visitors of the terrible cost of freedom. Young men who should have lived long lives rest there forever, far from the homes they loved. The bond between Normandy and Canada runs deep. For decades after the war, Norman families hosted Canadian veterans who returned to visit. They welcomed them into their homes like family. French schools became paired with Canadian schools. Students exchanged letters and learned each other's history. The gratitude was real and lasting. Even today, when people in Normandy learn someone is Canadian, they often say thank you. Their grandparents told them stories of liberation. They don't forget. Something remarkable happened in the years after the war. German and Canadian veterans began meeting at the battlefields. At first, it was awkward. These men had tried to kill each other. But they discovered something. They had all been young and scared. They had all followed orders and done their duty. In old age, they could respect each other as soldiers without hating each other as enemies. Former tank commanders who had fought at Falaise shook hands. They shared stories. Their families became friends. Youth exchange programs brought German and Canadian teenagers together to learn about peace. War turned into lessons about reconciliation. Falaise changed how Canada saw itself. Before World War II, Canada was seen as part of the British Empire. Canadians fought in British uniforms under British commanders. But at Falaise, Canadians fought as their own army under their own generals. They proved they were excellent soldiers. After the war, Canada became more independent. Canadian foreign policy reflected this new confidence. Canada would help its allies, but make its own decisions. The pride soldiers felt at Falaise helped shape a nation's character. Military schools around the world still study what happened at Falaise. General Simons's tactics appear in textbooks. His night attack method became standard teaching. The way he combined infantry, tanks, artillery, and air support showed how modern warfare should work. Officers learning their trade study how the Canadians broke through in 48 hours. They learned that speed and surprise can overcome strong defenses. They learned that innovation matters as much as courage. The children and grandchildren of Falaise veterans carried their stories forward. Many grew up hearing about the war at family dinners. Grandpa didn't talk much about the fighting, but sometimes he would share a memory, a funny moment, a friend he lost, the day Falaise fell. These stories became family treasures, passed down through generations. Military museums across Canada preserve letters, photographs, and uniforms. Families donate their grandfathers' medals. Each artifact tells a story about ordinary men who did extraordinary things. As the last veterans passed away in the early 2000s and 2020s, the way we remember changed. No longer could we shake their hands and hear their voices. The living memory became history. This makes remembering even more important. We have to tell their stories so future generations understand. We have to visit the cemeteries and monuments. We have to teach our children why these men fought and what they accomplished. Falaise teaches us important lessons about war and humanity. It shows that courage exists in ordinary people when circumstances demand it. It shows that even in the horror of battle, moments of kindness and mercy survive. It proves that small nations can make big differences. Canada wasn't a superpower, but Canadian soldiers shortened the war and saved countless lives. That matters. The story also reminds us that victory comes at a cost. 1,470 Canadian casualties in 48 hours. Young men who never came home. Families who grieved for decades. Towns destroyed. Lives shattered. We celebrate the victory, but we must never forget the price. Montgomery's words, "They've bloody well done it," meant more than praise for a battle won. He recognized something fundamental about the Canadian soldiers. They had determination, they had skill, they had courage. They proved themselves equal to any army in the world. That recognition mattered then and matters now. The Canadian Memorial at Bretteville-sur-Lez Cemetery bears a simple inscription. They gave their tomorrow for our today. Those words capture the essence of sacrifice. The soldiers who died at Falaise never got to live the lives they should have lived. They never grew old. They never had children or grandchildren. They never sat on porches, telling stories, or played with their great-grandchildren. They gave up all their tomorrows so that we could live in freedom. Every summer, red poppies bloom among the grass at the Canadian cemetery. The flowers grow wild, bright splashes of color among the white stones. They remind us of the young men who rest there. They remind us that from death and destruction life returns. They remind us that peace is precious because it was bought at such terrible cost. Falaise was more than a battle. It was a moment when ordinary men became heroes. It was a moment when Canada proved itself to the world. It was a moment when courage and sacrifice changed history. 80 years later, the story still matters. It still teaches us. And as long as people remember and honor those who fought, those men will never truly die. They live on in our memory, in our freedom, and in our gratitude. That is the real legacy of Falaise.